Now, if we step back a little bit to understand the economic background of this migration, besides the political and religious background that I began with at the beginning, the Inquisition and so on, searching for places where they could freely practice Judaism, first as crypto Jews, sometimes even in a Portuguese environment like Brazil, and then later openly as Jews. This was against the backdrop of a much larger economic phenomenon known as the triangular trade. Basically, the way it looked, and this is somewhat of an oversimplification, but nevertheless captures the larger picture, you have manufactured goods coming out of the great colonial empires of Europe, in particular Portugal and England and the Netherlands, and they're bringing their manufactured goods down to Africa. They are then trading them for slaves, and these enslaved peoples are then shipped across the Atlantic Ocean through the notorious and horrific Middle Passage, where they are then deposited in South America and the Caribbean, and to a certain degree in the 13 colonies. I don't especially like this map because it tends to imply they're going straight to the 13 colonies, but in reality, many of them are being dropped off in places like Curacao and then being resold and shipped up to the Americas. The Caribbean is extremely important for all of this trade. And then from the Americas, the southern Mesoamerican and North American continents, you have raw materials, all kinds of, furs and things like that coming from Canada. But from the Caribbean, you have in particular cane sugar that is traveling. And by the way, the cane sugar requires heavy amounts of labor, and that's where the slaves come in. They are employed in these massive plantations to harvest the cane sugar and then ship it off. From the Americas, you have things like tobacco, for example, or cotton, the same kind of idea. It's shipped off to Europe, where it's processed into manufactured goods, and this cycle went on for a few hundred years, to the tremendous misery of the enslaved Africans in particular. So how did Jews fit into this overall picture? The issue of Jews and the slave trade is especially heated and is used often in polemics and apologetics. I'm going to return to it in just one second, but I do want to say that on the whole, the participation of Jews in the entire institution of slavery was largely unremarkable. And what I mean by that was they were not especially distinguished by a high level of moral allergy to this institution, which caused so much pain, nor were they grossly overrepresented, particularly when you correct for not only the tiny size of their population, but their place in the overall socioeconomic structure. In fact, when you look more closely at the trade, what were Jews doing primarily in the Caribbean, where a lot of this slave trade was happening? They had the so-called grote vaart, the large trade, these are Dutch terms, which involved those three basic elements, the raw goods, the manufactured goods, and the enslaved Africans. And Jews were only, tangentially involved in the grote vaart. They were very heavily involved, however, in what was called the kleine vaart, or the small trade, which was lots of things that supported the overall economic structure. Like, for example, around Curacao, where there was a large Jewish settlement, the Jews, there were Jews definitely who were involved in plantations and owning slaves and so on. We're going to look at one of those in particular. But primarily Jews were involved in sort of supportive industries. Like, for example, the ships come in and they need all kinds of goods. They need foodstuffs. They need to have their ropes repaired, their sails repaired. They need tar. They need all kinds of things to be able to outfit the ships and so on. And so Jews would be very much involved in kind of the peripheral industries to support the overall economic structure. So it would be incorrect to say that Jews were, on the one hand, totally divorced from the grote vaart, because they were involved in all of the economic secondary activities, but it would also be wrong to say that they were overly represented in the slave trade as well. There are some exceptions that prove the rule, if you will. Jerónimo Núñez da Costa, for example, also known as Moses Curiel, he lived between 1620 and 1697. He was a very important Portuguese agent in Amsterdam, deeply involved in the slave trade. If we look at Suriname, which is also on the coast of South America, in a place they called the Juden Savannah, or the Jewish Savannah. It was established in the 1600s, and it absorbs all kinds of Jewish migrants to the territory, including those who fled Recife. Some of them made their way up to the New Amsterdam at that time, and others went to Juden Savannah. And at its peak, around the year 1700, there were about 500 plantation owners, primarily Jews, and about 9,000 enslaved Africans. It was a difficult kind of industry as a whole. There were multiple slave revolts, there were attacks from foreigners, but what really caused the Juden Savannah to collapse, and in fact, much of the slave trade as a whole was really changed by this, was the development of the beet sugar industry in the 1760s. Beets grow in Europe. They can be transformed into sugar. Europeans had developed a addiction really to sugar once it had been exported cheaply from the Caribbean, but it was cane sugar that was sent, and molasses and rum, all derivatives of cane sugar. But once Europe had figured out ways to make sugar locally rather than engaging this expensive shipping across the Atlantic, all of a sudden the cane sugar industry collapsed. And it had a disastrous effect on the plantations, including Juden Savannah. But as an illustration of how the Jewish economy was really much more diverse, it really didn't change the overall Jewish economy that much. But it had, a general depressing effect because so much of the Jewish economy was attached to the slave-based cane sugar industry. So therefore, from the 1760s onward, there was much more of an impetus for Jews to look for, better avenues for economic development. Now, in this regard, just looking at those numbers again, 500 plantation owners, right? Jews primarily from Europe, and 9,000 enslaved people. As we see with non-Jewish plantation populations, this led to the development, sometimes very exploitative, of a Eurafrican Jewish population. What this means is that many slave owners, typically males, would take female slaves as wives or as concubines and would produce offspring, and they would have some relationship with those offspring in some cases, but nevertheless, now you have a new population of people. And how were they dealt with in Jewish society? This is fascinating. It is important to note that the actual gender disparity of Jews was somewhat better. It was still definitely very male focused, but it was somewhat better than the non-Jewish population. This was due in part to the fact that Jews tended to migrate as family units at a higher rate than other Europeans. They're all fleeing persecution, and so therefore traveling as a family makes more sense. But it also has to do with the fact that there were specific institutions dedicated to trying and produce Jewish marriages. The Dotar Society in particular was extremely important. This was a society based in Amsterdam that, collected funds and underwrote marriages as far as possible for poor Jewish brides. So the problem was not quite as acute for Jewish populations as it was for non-Jewish, but nevertheless it was significant. So you have a look at this remarkable picture here, which I think illustrates the whole story. On the left is Maria Louise de Hart, obviously with some African descent, and she is married to Johannes Ellis, also of African descent. They're dressed, however, in very European clothing, and they are in fact very important people. What's their parentage? So Maria's father was a Jewish plantation owner, and her mother was a freed slave. And Johannes Ellis's father was a non-Jewish Dutch governor of the region, and his mother was a woman from Ghana. This picture was taken, by the way, in 1846. So how do we know about these populations that racially look different from Ashkenazic Jewries or even from Sephardic Jews coming straight out of the Iberian Peninsula? There's amazing research done by Professor Aviva Ben-Ur. And basically the kind of sources we have are slave manumission records, that is when slaves are freed. This is something that had to be recorded because obviously, if a person was a freed slave, they had to have paperwork to ensure that they could preserve their freedom. And it's also important to note that this was an opportunity for the state to tax slave owners if they wished to free their slaves. It was an expensive proposition to free a slave. You had to provide an annuity, you had to provide like income for them and so on. And so people would generally only manumit their slaves if they felt an emotional connection with them, for example, if they were concubines or if they were children. And we have significant numbers of these slave manumission records that give us a sense of why Jews would engage in this process. Related to this, by the way, is conversion, which we'll talk about in a second. We also have wills of former slave owners who then freed their slaves and then chose to bequeath money to them. And finally, we have burial records, which indicate what happened to these freed slaves or their offspring once they had become Jewish. Were they buried in a Jewish cemetery, for example, and so on. And you have this large phenomenon of what were called reputed children. And these are the children typically of Jewish male plantation owners, like in Yod and Savannah, with wives or concubines of African descent who may not have had the benefits of conversion and so on, but nevertheless were included in the wills of Jewish testators. Some of them are quite fascinating. For example, Emmanuel Baruch Lusada, who died in Jamaica in 1795, he left a very interesting will where one of his sons was to be awarded a significant amount of money. And he also, this son, by the way, who was a reputed child, was actually raised by Emmanuel Baruch's cousin, who apparently had a tremendous amount of fondness for him. And in her own will, she had left money to this child as well. But what is especially ironic is that Emmanuel Baruch was cognizant of the fact that his children, presumably from his European wife, it appears that his reputed child was the child of a mistress. He anticipated that his European wife and his offspring with his European wife would actually object to the allocation of funds to this reputed child, and so he actually put a codicil in his will that if any of them, his wife or his children by that wife, disputed the will or questioned the allocation of funds to their half-brother, they would formally lose all of the money that had been allocated to them in the will. It gives you a sense of the range of emotional attachment that these Jewish testators had for their offspring, even though they weren't necessarily born by European mothers. Now, it is important to note, as Professor Ben-Ur points out, that the records are spotty and inconsistent, and it's difficult to really project the overall picture based on these cases. They might entirely be something that reflects on individuals who had particularly close relationships, where otherwise one can imagine the horrific degree of abuse that could arise in these family relationships because of the intrinsically exploitative nature of the institution of slavery as a whole. We nevertheless do have lots of examples of the offspring of such relations being converted to Judaism upon manumission. We have examples of infant conversion. We have all kinds of things going on that are quite fascinating. This is, by the way, a picture of the mikveh of Suriname. It's now dry, but this would have been filled with water and would have been part of the conversion process. However, taking all of this together is a complicated picture. It's fascinating just to see the little details here and there, but it's a complicated picture. It is important to note that one other set of records, and those are synagogue records, are especially telling as to how this society functioned in Yod and Savannah. The reality is that it appears that the offspring of Africans who were converted to Judaism were accepted within the Jewish community, but nevertheless there was kind of a layover of racial ideology within that acceptance. This is, again, not at all exceptional when you consider the complicated degrees of racial distinctions that the overall society was making between Europeans and Africans, and half European, half Africans, and 1/4 Africans, 1/4 Europeans, 1/8, and so on. And they actually had a whole chart to describe what a person was, depending on how much European and how much African ancestry they had. In the synagogue of Suriname, you'll have a racial distinction between two groups of people, the so-called congregantes, or congregants, and that would refer to these partially African Jews, nevertheless Jews, but there was a distinction, and there were certain restrictions placed upon them where they could sit, often buried at the side of the cemetery, things like that. And so-called yechidim, which is hard to translate exactly. It sort of means like, it literally means exceptional people, but it really means like unique people. And that's the purely European Jews who have more privileges, are buried in the main section of the synagogue and things like that. So to think that, once they were converted to Judaism, they were automatically socially accepted, I think that would be kind of Pollyannish to think that that would happen. Nevertheless, they were considered halachically as Jews. And maybe I conclude by saying that, this is an interesting illustration of the overlay of societal prejudices upon a halachic basis, because in terms of Jewish law or halacha, race plays absolutely no status in the role that a Jew has with regards their obligations, responsibilities, and so on. There's no distinctions made whatsoever within the halakhic literature that bear any reference to a person's racial background or appearance or so on. So all of this other material of separating the congregants between congregantes and yechidim and separate burial sections, things like that, it's either totally innovated as a social reflection of that time, or sometimes it's a complete contradiction of halakha. Nevertheless, this is how the society functioned. There's some great work. Please have a look at Professor Aviva Ben-Ur's books on this. Quite fascinating. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching.